Okay.
All right. Professor Keqian, thank you very much for joining us today. It's good to see you again. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, I can hear you.
Oh, fantastic, fantastic.
Should I say good afternoon or good evening?
I think it is evening in China where you
Yeah,
are. It is precisely
noon
noon in Germany where I am moderating from. It is 1 p.m. in South Africa, and it is 12 noon in Nigeria, West Africa. So I'm sure if you said good evening or good afternoon, there must be someone here who that will appeal to. Good to see you once again. It's been some time, and thank you for accepting to deliver the March edition of University of Pretoria's philosophy seminar. Very soon we will be starting. I will begin by introducing you, and then we'll give you the floor to speak for 45 minutes or thereabouts, and then the microphone and the chat box will be opened up for our participants to join with questions and comments and discussions, as the case may be. As I am during my moderation, I'll take our time to admit people who are joining. I hope I'm able to combine the two properly without any disruptions. So let us start formally. Colleagues and students and from different parts of the world where you're joining us from, this is the March 2022 edition of University of Pretoria's philosophy seminar. And with us today to deliver this edition's lecture is Professor Keqian. Let me say a little bit about Professor Keqian. He obtained his PhD from Fudan University in Shanghai, China, so many years ago, and taught for more than 30 years at Nanjing Normal University in China, where he's now retired from, but has been appointed as Professor Emeritus in the same university. He is also contracted with the Sanjiang University there in Nanjing, China, currently. He's been an active scholar and philosopher within China and internationally, and has been a member and at some other times board member of some international organizations. That includes the International Society for Universal Dialogue, where he served as vice chairman between 2016 and 2018. So his research interest spans quite a number of topics in philosophy and culture: Chinese philosophy, Confucianism, Taoism, traditional Chinese culture, comparative philosophy and culture, as the case may be. He's much more recently has been occupied with looking at the comparative nature of philosophical discourse in the global South. He's a firm believer that epistemologies of the South should interact more amongst themselves, so rather than besides the forced sometimes interaction with Western epistemology. And this is an idea that he has championed in several of his papers. By the way, he has published about a dozen books in Chinese language and over 100 research articles in reputable international journals in both the Chinese and the English language. So we have with us today a consummate scholar, one who has seen it all and introduced several new concepts in the discipline. One recent one being the idea of Zhongdaology, that is sort of from the Chinese word zhong, meaning balance, that is been using to weave a sort of method for engaging cross-culturally, and so on and so forth. So today, Professor Keqian will be addressing the topic of why and how should Chinese philosophy engage with African philosophy. So from that topic, you could see that he intends to kill two birds with one stone. The first one being epistemological, looking at the why of things, and the second one being methodological, looking at the how, that the Chinese philosophy as an epistemology of the South could engage with African philosophy, another epistemology of the South. And this is the new dimension that comparative and intercultural studies, is tilting towards. In the literature out there, we have always seen different cultural perspectives to knowledge, attempting most times unsuccessfully to engage with the epistemology of the West, who really most times appear to be uninterested in such endeavors. Whereas we can actually achieve more if scholars and thinkers from the epistemologies of the South engaged more amongst themselves. And Professor Keqian is one scholar who is making monumental efforts in that direction. And today, he will be discussing his ideas on why and how the Chinese philosophy should engage with the African philosophy. And so with this, I welcome you all once again from different parts of the world, and thank you immensely for making our time to join us this March 2022 edition of University of Pretoria's Philosophy Seminar Series. Welcome you once again on behalf of the department, and I know that quite a number of persons from the department are here, students and colleagues alike, including the head of department. So welcome every one of you. Now let us give Professor Keqian some 45 minutes or thereabout to talk to us. Thereafter, I will reopen the microphone for all of us to join and ask our questions, engagements, and contributions. Thank you very much once again. And Professor Keqian, thank you for joining us. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Chimakonam. And thank you for your invitation and introduction. I'm much honored to be invited to the University of Pretoria Philosophy Seminar to give this talk about conversation and comparison between Chinese and African philosophy. My academic specialty is ancient Chinese philosophy. As for African philosophy, I have just read some materials and have a superficial understanding of it. Therefore, I don't think that I'm a qualified speaker to give a very deeply insight on this topic, comparison between African and Chinese philosophy. But after I have a preliminary search, I found that in fact, the topic of comparing Chinese philosophy with African philosophy is rarely touched upon. There are only, I have only found a handful of relevant research works. One book is written by the German philosophy, Heinz Kimmer, and the Dutch psychologists. The book that is, two scholars have published comparison papers between Ubuntu and Confucian ideas of Ren. One is written by a British scholar who is teaching in Tsinghua University. His name is Daniel Bell. And also, I found a paper written by the scholar on the World Congress of Philosophy, which is held in 2018 in Beijing, China. So compared with the large number of comparative studies of Chinese Western philosophy or African Western philosophy, the comparison studies between Chinese and African philosophy is very real. I come to this question by chance in July, as Jensen have introduced. It was in July 2016 on the 11th World Congress of ISUD held in Warsaw, Poland. After I give my presentation about Confucian philosophy of Zhongdaology, and then Professor Chimakonam come to me. He said that what I called the way of Zhong was likely an equivalent of a concept in African philosophy. And he called it as Ezumezu, which is based on Igbo language in Nigeria. So this have arose my interest in the comparison between Chinese philosophy and African philosophy. As we all know that due to the long dominance of the Western philosophical tradition in philosophy studies, Western philosophy naturally become the sole standard of universal philosophy. Philosophy source of the European white male thinkers. Although this situation in the past decades have changed a great deal, but the conceptual category systems and academic frameworks used in the study of non-Western philosophy are still dominated by the Western philosophical tradition. So by doing conversation and comparison between and among non-Western philosophical traditions, such as the, to share the screen, share my screen. Okay. By comparison and conversation between non-Western philosophical traditions, such as the Chinese and African philosophy, we might find that there are some commonalities in conceptions, ideas, and logic or values which are different from that of the Western philosophical tradition. And I think this is very significant. I have just read that Daniel Bell in his paper, he asked this question: what if it turned out that two major non-Western traditions together comprised of more than 2 billion people have more in common than either as the liberal traditions? What if it turned out that many more people in the world non-Western values? This is a question. It's worth for us to study. So I see that some African philosophers put forward the idea of conversational philosophy in recent years, which suggesting that the different philosophical traditions and thoughts to conduct a comparison in common rational space to confirm their similarities and differences. I think this kind of conversation might more likely happen between two non-Western philosophical traditions, because the conversation between the two non-Western philosophy is more likely to be equal. It will not be using the standard of one side to evaluate or test the other. Come together and have a conversation will definitely benefit the world philosophy in general. In order to promote further research, my lecture will be just to make some preliminary discussion on several important areas or topics in which Chinese philosophy and African philosophy may have some common discourse and can launch significant conversation and comparison. The first topic is the so-called legitimacy issue of Chinese and African philosophy. as we know that the word philosophy, the concept of philosophy, and even the word and concept did not exist in China or Africa before the introduction of Western philosophy. Therefore, no matter no matter of process as a discipline, it often encounters the so-called legitimacy issue. So in China, the word of philosophy in Chinese was originally created by Japanese scholars in the modern time, referring to the concept of philosophy in the sense of Western. Although we know that in China we have 2,500 years history of Chinese philosophy. We have many philosophical traditions in the ancient time, like Confucianism, Taoism, Maoism, legalism, Zen Buddhism, New Confucianism, etc. But the philosophy as a modern discipline, it is formatted with Western concept and thinking framework, just like the famous Chinese philosopher Feng Youlan. He said in his introduction to the history of Chinese philosophy, he said that philosophy is a Western term. One of the main tasks of the recent study of history of Chinese philosophy is to select and describe from among the various scholarships in Chinese history those which can be called philosophy in the West. So in his saying, philosophy, if we talk standard, so there are some people questioning the legitimacy of Chinese philosophy as a discipline. For instance, in September, Jacques Derrida was visiting China and having a dining with some Chinese philosophers. He declared that there were only Derrida's dinner table comments is a casual comments on Chinese philosophy has caused unexpected response in Chinese academic circle, especially among philosophers. Some of them echoed with Derrida and stated that the question of the legitimacy of Chinese philosophy. Some even think that they have no such thing of Chinese philosophy. But others were angry with the indignation, and they are angry with indignation and criticize Derrida's arrogance and ignorance. So it has triggered an even vaster discussion on the legitimacy issue of Chinese philosophy afterwards. I have read some discussion in African philosophy, and I found that there is also similar legitimacy issues, questions in the African philosophy, because there are the concept of African philosophy were not existed before Placid Temper's Bantu philosophy. The Bantu philosophy written by Father Placid Tempers, it was in 1950s. So there is also this kind of a question. And comparatively speaking, the legitimacy problems and crises of African philosophy probably are more serious than that of Chinese philosophy, because unlike the situation in China, there seems to have been little literature on African philosophy before the middle of the 20th century. And it is also because the Westerners have long ignored the African philosophy and even assumed that Africans were incapable of rational thought. For instance, David Hume David Hume said that African, the black man, was incapable of logical thinking. And Hegel actually, he displaced the Chinese philosophy, and also he displaced the African philosophy. He said that Africa proper, that means the source of the desert of Sahara, is laying beyond the day of self-conscious history, and is enveloped in the dark mantle of night. Another French sociologist, his name is Brewer. He also believed that Africans were largely pre-logical. And I also found that contemporary philosophers or philosophy scholars in Africa also have different views on this question. Some people think that since African philosophy is philosophy, so if it exists, it must be universal rather than a kind of a ethnic philosophy. Some African scholars also deny the existence of the so-called African philosophy. But other philosophers publicly defend the idea of ethnic philosophy, insist that the African philosophy should be based on the cultural tradition and African people's life situation, highlight the African cultural characteristics of ideas, attitudes, logic, and perception. So it should include African spirituality, religious, ethical, and cultural traditions. So some scholars pointed out that there is no absolute unified definition of legitimacy for philosophy, and that it is reasonable to take the framework, so they think that it is unreasonable to take only the framework and paradigms derived from Western philosophy as the standard of legitimacy. So some African scholars even proposed the need for decolonizing the mind, or conceptual decolonization. So this question, this legitimacy question, I don't have a solution, answer to a final answer of this, but I think we need to suggest some, we have to question this issue from these aspects. First, who has the right to legitimate philosophy? Fundamentally, the so-called legitimacy issue is due to the dominant monopoly of Western culture in the academic field in the past few centuries. If we understand philosophy as the ultimate search for wisdom, or as a rational reflection on the cultural rooted in a living world, and look at it without racial and cultural prejudice, there's no reason to deny that the Chinese and Africans are capable of rational thinking and have their own philosophies and philosophical traditions. The so-called legitimacy issue is only relative to the specific philosophical categories, conceptions, problems, and criterions in the Western philosophical tradition. And then the second question is, are there any cultural particularity and a linguistic difference in rationality, logic, and conceptualization in philosophy? I agree that reason should belong to all humankind and be universal. But in the Western philosophical tradition, the only correct solution, we should ask the question, is the Western philosophical tradition the only correct solution to human reason? Does non-Western world have the right to express its cultural spirit and rationality in its own language and conceptual systems? The third question is conceptual decolonization necessary and possible? For this questions, I don't have an answer, but I think that by conversation and comparison between non-Western philosophical traditions, such as the Chinese and African philosophy, we might find that these two have some common similarities compared with the Western philosophy, which in some sense can prove that the Western philosophy category logical system, which have been considered as the only standard of legitimacy of philosophy, are actually not necessarily as such, not necessarily that universal. It might be just a kind of local or parochial knowledge. So this is just it's an open question. We have to do more research on it. And now we go to some concrete topics. The second topic is the conceptual problem of being in Chinese and African philosophy. The categories of Western philosophy concepts are often thought to be universal, but many actually be only probably, I think, for instance, the concept of being. Being is the most important concept in the ontology of Western philosophy, and it is also a controversial concept. And there are many dispute and different explanations of it. Nevertheless, it is so important to Western philosophy that it would not be philosophy at all without discussing this concept. But when we come to Chinese philosophy or African philosophy, we find that the being as a philosophical concept, it is based on the predicate verb to be. And it is also included the present participle being, also have some root in Greek and German language. However, in ancient China, in early ancient Chinese language, the Chinese language before the Qing dynasty, there was no such a predicate verb. So this concept of being has not been conceptualized in ancient Chinese philosophy. So as a result, when the Western philosophy works have been translated into Chinese, the translators find it very difficult to find an exact Chinese word for the concept of being. Modern Chinese scholars use different Chinese words to translate these words, such as 是, 有, 在, or 存在, or 存有. It's just according to different contexts. So these words, these Chinese characters are different words in Chinese language, have slightly different meanings, yet they all share some meaning of the concept of being, but not an exact equivalent of the philosophical concept of being. So if we, from the ancient Chinese perspective, the concept of being probably is just like a misconceptualized idea, which have mixed different meanings. When I say this is not to say that ancient Chinese philosophy never discussed ontological questions about the nature of the world and its ultimate reality. Actually, Chinese philosophers use different words, different terms to discuss the fundamental reality, such as Dao, Li, Taiji, Qi, etc., etc. The Chinese usually, the yin yang, for instance, the yin yang is a concept represent the fundamental reality of everything. Everything have a yin yang inside it. We also have the 5 elements theory. 5 elements in refers to the things in the world. Everything in the world is composed of the 5 elements. So we cannot say that Chinese people don't have a philosophy of the ultimate reality or the Western called being. Here I want to suggest, I want to put forward some of my understanding of the most important points in Chinese ancient philosophy, the ancient Chinese understanding of being. First, they have two different beings or things. The things in Chinese language is called 事物, but 事 and 物 are different things. 物 are more materialized, objective, substantial, tangible, exists longer, while 事 is more like an event relying on human interference and participation. So how could these two different things share a common being? How could the being, for instance, a stone in the mountain, be discussed together with the being of a shi, like a school or such a conference, that is a shi. But they are all things, but they are different things. Another Chinese idea of being is that being comes from no being. That is Lao Tzu said, 有生于无. All things come out from nothing. According to the Taoist philosophy in ancient China, nothingness, no being, is more fundamental. The third point is that being is full of contradiction. Every coin has have two sides. Things exist relatively. The shield exists because there is a spear. Everything has its positive and negative sides. As Lao Tzu said, happiness depends on misfortune, and misfortune underlies happiness. Okay, the fourth one is that being is dynamic and changing. Being and becoming, nature and nurture are, related to each other. Anything, no matter a wu or a shi, it always has its root, its origin, and its branches, that is the result. 物有本末. Its beginning and its end, that is 事有终始. Nothing is unchangeable. Things are not just a static being, but also in a process of becoming. For instance, human being. Human being is not only natural, but also a result of nurture. That is cultivation. And the fifth point is that being is contextual and relative. For instance, what is the being of the axe? An axe is a tool for cutting wood. But when you use it to killing, that is a weapon. So the being of the axe depends on its function. And in ancient China, we also believe that being cannot be separated from its function and property. And we call it 道不离气. Without its properties, attributes, functions, capacities, etc., a thing will be nothing. That is why Confucius, when Confucius teaching his students about the Ren, the most important virtue in Confucian ethics, he never gave a definition of what is being, but he usually pointed out in such a situation, what is the Ren will function, what is a people have the Ren, the virtue will behave. Told his disciples how it would behave in a given situation and what effect the Ren will have. Now we come to the African philosophy. I have read some of the, not all, they have a lot of works about African philosophy. I found that one African scholar said that some African language, like Igbo, does not have an exact equivalent of being also. But this doesn't mean that African people don't think ontologically or think about the ultimate reality they use different words. They have some African words. I don't know how to pronounce it correctly. Ubu, nuntu, onye, if, uwa. And Tempers, in his Bantu philosophy, he pointed out that the Westerners conceive the transcendental notion of being by separating it from its attribute, that is force. But the Bantu cannot. Force, in his thought, is necessary element in being, and the concept of force is inseparable from the definition of being. There is no idea among Bantu of being divorced from the idea of force. Without the element force, being cannot be conceived. Being is force and has nothing to do with essence. A being is defined by what it can do rather than by what it is. And the Tempers also hold that African ontology is dynamic. He said that Westerners hold a static conception of being, but the Africans are dynamic. I also read that African philosophy also believe that beings stand in relation to each other and mutually influence on each other. For instance, Mugabe B. Ramos, he explained that Ubuntu is a combination of Ubun and Untu. It's a connection or coexistence of the ontological and epistemological aspects of same things. The abstract aspects are always dwell in the concrete things. So I think they have some similarities, commonalities among the Chinese and African thinking. But the ontology, I have to agree that ontology is not the most important topic in ancient Chinese philosophy. Chinese philosophy is quite different from Western philosophy in its understanding of being, but moreover, in fact, ontology, which aims at exploring being or the ultimate reality, is not the content of Chinese philosophy. But also I have the question, why is only the knowledge of exploring ontology regarded as philosophy? I think the strength of Chinese philosophy lies not in ontology, but in what I call Zhongdaology. So I want to give some explanation of the concept of Zhongdaology. Zhongdaology is the philosophical inquiry for the way of Zhong or Zhongdao, which is based on all the primordially related semantic meanings embodied in the Chinese character Zhong. Zhong is a very important philosophical idea in early Confucianism. Both the received ancient Confucian classics and the newly discovered ancient bamboo manuscripts tells us that adhering on the principle of Zhong was an important political admonitions which have been transmitted and inherited among the early ancient Chinese political leaders from generation to generation. Zhong, the Zhong is the third value. It's the third value, which is the mediation or integration of the contradicting or opposing two ends. Zhong has the meaning of justice, fairness, impartiality, neither doing too much nor doing insufficient, appropriateness, exactly hitting the target, etc., etc. So adhere to the principle of Zhong is a very important political experience and wisdom in ancient China. So they have some old sayings, for instance, keeping to the center, holding the two and using the middle. And the modern philosopher, some of the modern philosophers have developed this philosophical idea into a concept called 一分为三, one divided into three parts. That means any things not only can divide it into the contradictory two sides, but also they have a third value. So it is called the 一分为三. So the Zhong philosophy is different from the dualistic oppositional thinking, searching for the middle rather than excluding the middle is the Chinese philosophy advocate. At the same time, the Zhong is a degree. It's not an entity. It's not a substantial entity. It's a degree rather than a fixed static entity. It is dynamic and contextual. The philosophy of Zhongdaology advocates harmony in diversity. That means it advocates inclusive and integrate the different contradicting values. Advocate compromise rather than confrontation. So in general, Zhongdaology provides a Confucian logic of thinking. It is not only a philosophical, epistemological, or methodology, but also a practical guiding principle for establishing ethical norms, moral standards, social justice, and political principles. The Zhongdaological philosophy indicates an association between human beings and their world, a coincidence between subjectivity and objectivity, a harmony of internal world and external world, and intersubjectivity perspective. So also have the concept, the coincidence between self and other, self and the group, an equivalent equilibrium among different ideas and divergences. The Zhongdaological thinking advocates inclusiveness and harmony when dealing with conflicts and contradictions. This way of thinking is the basic logic of Confucianism. It runs through the traditional Confucian theory of ethics and politics. In a sense, it can be called the Confucian meta-ethics and meta-politics. I have a full length of book about this topic, but it is in Chinese. Maybe in the future, it will be published in English. Now we come to the African philosophy. African philosophy, as I had told that amazingly in 2016 on the Warsaw Conference of ICUD, Professor Chimakonam told me that there is a similar idea and a similar way of thinking in African philosophy, which is called Ezumezu. I'm not sure if I pronounce it correctly. And then in the past few years, Professor Chimakonam, he sent me copies of his research papers and a whole book on this issue. I'm not sure if the two ideas in Chinese and African philosophy are exactly the same, but after I read some of his works, I believe these two ideas do share many similarities. And this is a very interesting topic and it deserves further exploration. According to Chimakonam, Ezumezu is an Igbo word meaning the collective, the aggregate or the totality of all that is most viable, most potent, and most powerful. And he said that as he put it, Ezumezu represent a three-valued complementary logic with three supplementary law of thought. And he put it in Ezumezu model, the two standard values are treated as sub-contraries rather than contradictories. This is because the Ezumezu is a distinct value in itself. So according Chimakonam, or my understanding, based on my understanding, I think that Ezumezu suggests a kind of dynamic and flexible reasoning, because Chimakonam said that these studies are contextual, true or false relative to situation. In contextual semantics, that which is true only in a context. It could be false in another. This is the realist rather than an epistemic reading of the three-value thought model. And this thinking also highlights a complementary unit, the intermediate third value, where the two polar values complement. It also emphasizes that true or false is contextual dependent. The idea of evaluating each proposition within specific context. So we can find that the Ezumezu logic shares some ideas in common with the Chinese Confucian Zhongdao. It emphasizes the proper intermediate third value, which is not fixed or absolute, dynamic and contextual. It tries to bridge the gap between opposing and conflicting things by finding the mediating, compromising third value. It indicates that opposing sides, different things, are actually related and interdependent. This way of thinking is contrasting to the traditional Western way of thinking, which is persists on the law of absolute difference and absolute identity, in which things are mutually exclusive, as Aristotelian law of excluded middle holds that either a thing is or is not. In other words, if a thing is equal to itself, it cannot be equal to or different from itself. Cannot be unequal to or different from itself. This law implies absolute differences and absolute identity, in which things advocate a kind of included. The things are mutually exclusive. So this difference, I think they have some commonality between Chinese thinking and the African thinking. And now this brings me to the last question, that is political philosophy and democracy. In actually this difference I mentioned in the Chinese and African philosophy with Western binary thinking have an influence on the social political issues. I think that I have read that some African philosopher, I guess this philosopher is from the University of Pretoria, Professor Leonhard Prieg. He believes that political philosophy is the first philosophy. Every philosophy is ultimately a political expression. So I quite agree with his view. On many occasions, when we talk about philosophy, we cannot avoid its socio-political significance. I think there are three prominent influences of Western traditional philosophical thinking on social and political philosophy. First, the individualist understanding of human being or people. People is understood as completely independent atomic individuals without a mutual bond and mutual influence among them. And these individuals inborn with certain political rights. And the second, the dualistic opposition thinking. The belief that there are irreconcilable poles, two poles of opposition poles in social politics, like individualism, totalitarianism, liberalism, slavery, democracy and autocracy is actual. And the third, another logic from the modern Western thinking is the logic of a unilinear evolution. They are backward towards advanced, savagery towards modernity, barbarism towards civilization, etc. So this actually based on the Eurocentrist criteria. This is why some Western philosophers think that the history has an end. Professor Francis Fukuyama has a book entitled The End of History and the Last Man. That means when all nations, all culture in the world have assimilated with the level of the current modern Western standard, adapted their economy, political system, and the international order, the design, the history will come to an end. After that, there will be no further development of the major principles and systems, since all the really major problems have been solved. But are these premises and assumptions universal? Correct? Is it correct? I think from the point of view of Chinese philosophy and African philosophy, maybe not. So we come back to the Chinese philosophy. Chinese philosophical understand of the relationship between individuals and the group and the society in general. Chinese philosophy believes that human beings cannot live without community, cannot live without society. And the other beliefs is that realizing humanity by accomplishing one's self humanity by or through accomplishing the humanity of others. Selfishness is only the animal nature of man, while the true humanity lays in caring for other people and even other animals, even the animals. It is in the social group that individuals achieve their humanity by caring for others and doing things beneficial to the social group. So in general, Chinese philosophy thinks that individual, family, and clan, nation, and humanity are related. It's a whole, in a whole. Therefore, in Chinese ancient philosophy, they have some also have some points in ancient Chinese political philosophy. First, fair and justice is the essence of politics. 正者正也, and holding the principle of Zhong, that is no bias, no parties. Second, the people are the foundation. The people are more important than the ruler. But in Chinese words, we have two different words for the word people. One is 人, other is 民. 人 refers to the individual or individuals of people, where the 民 refers to the ontological people. I agree with some African philosophers. They suggest that people should be understood ontologically, not just understood as phenomenological individuals, or even as only statistic numbers. And for the word democracy, the word in modern Chinese, the modern Chinese word for democracy is 民主. But this word has an etymological origin in early ancient Chinese classics. But it has a different meaning. Compared to the concept in modern Western political philosophy, ancient Chinese, the words in ancient Chinese 民主, it means being the host of people, being reliable and accountable to the people. or ruling for the people. That means the ruler must be accountable for everything, take every responsibility for the people. Of course, this is not an exact equivalent to today's idea of democracy. But I think they have some links, and this also composed a background of Chinese characteristic democracy in contemporary China. Also for the development of the history, for the society, for the social institution, etc. In China, we don't have a unilinear logic. Actually, in China, we believe that everything go to the extreme will come back. That is 物极必反，盛极而衰. When things go to extreme, they go down. So every dynasty or regime have its rise and fall. The dialectical and dynamic view on the relationship of among different factors. So they have no, in ancient China, they have no absolutely contradict elements in social politics. They have different elements. For instance, revolution, hegemony, equality, competition, liberty. These are all used in a society. Society is composed of these different elements, and they have a dynamic and mutually promoting and mutually containing relations among them. This is a Chinese idea of social development. Now we come to the African philosophy. I know that the development of African modern philosophy presents obvious characteristics of political philosophy. Many African important political figures in modern times, such as these prestige leaders of Africa countries, they all have their works, and in order to deal with the problems encountered in the reconstruction of their own country and the rejuvenation of the nation, they all put forward their own political philosophies. This is quite similar to the situation in China. For instance, in modern time, Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Republic of China, Mao Zedong, the founder of the Republic of People's Republic of China, they also have a lot of philosophical thinking. They also have their political philosophy. The goal of that is to rejuvenation of the nation and the construction of new China. So it is worth noting that. I don't have I'm not qualified to evaluate the values of these prestige leaders, but I found that it is worth noting that when these African political figures thought about political philosophy, they all reflected their understanding of African culture heritage, especially their understanding of the relationship between individuals and groups in traditional Africa culture and the traditional communitarian society in Africa. So I also read that African philosophers also have a view on a special view, unique view on individual group relations. For instance, compared with the Western philosophy of I am, therefore I think, therefore I am, which takes the subjective I as a starting point of understanding human beings. But African philosophy tends to emphasize that I am because we are. I am because we are. And I believe that the best description of the relationship between the individual and the group is, a person. It's a person who is belong to this community. A person is a person through other persons. from the traditional African point of view, a person is a person through other persons. So the individual can be defined only as a member of society. This is determined by the communitarian character of African society. People have been socialized from the very beginning, brought up to form such strong bonds with large units of kinship that they belong, and by assuming that they are bound to society. Professor Ramos, he pointed out that Ubuntu, this word is a contribution to the world philosophy. Many people have accepted this idea, Ubuntu. Ubuntu means to be human being is to affirm one's humanity by recognizing the humanity of others, and on that basis, establish human relations with them. So African philosophy, generally speaking, is a kind of a communitarianist understanding. Take a communitarianist view on the issue of individual group relations, and try to seeking a balance, to balance the individual needs with communal needs. So I read that usually in African culture, they usually believe that group is more important than the individual. So in terms of the relationship between the individual and the group, African philosophy generally believes that the group is the priority. And the relationship between the two is not that the individual cedes his innate power to the group as understood by the Western individualism. It is the group that has power, and it is only through interaction with group that individual gain power and survive. I also read that African scholars also have their unique understanding of democracy. The social and political situation in contemporary African countries is very complicated, and there have been a lot of kind of a social political practice, political reform system. I don't have I'm not qualified to give an evaluation of all of this. However, I have noticed that some African scholars have pointed out some disadvantages of copying the Western party democracy system. For example, Weirdo, I think he has a whole book of African philosophy. He points out that trying to imitate majoritarian democracy in the conditions of African ethnic stratifications is a tragic experiment from which African can hardly expect anything but the upside of salvation. Therefore, many scholars are thinking about what is the most suitable form of democracy in Africa, and believe that the multi-party political system currently operating in Africa might not be, at least not be the only form of democracy, and maybe even not an appropriate form. Some attempts to think of possible alternative embodiment of democracy. It is being remembered that in many parts of traditional Africa, decision by consensus in the governing council, ensured a veritable democracy without any analog of the present day system of parties. So it is possible to have a non-party, non-adversary form of democracy, a consensual system of democracy. I think this is a question worth further research by us today. So, okay, let me conclude it. Chinese philosophy and African philosophy can carry out conversation in wide range of fields and have a lot of common discourses that can be exchanged. Although the historical and cultural background of China and Africa are quite different, they have also experienced a similar fate in the face of the expansion of the Western civilization in the recent centuries. The revival of Chinese philosophy and African philosophy in contemporary times has the significance of national rejuvenation and enhancing the confidence of national culture. So nowadays, the social and economic exchanges between China and Africa are becoming more and more frequent and closer. There are many Chinese, I know that there are many Chinese living and working in Africa. And although there are many Africans living and working in China, especially in the Guangdong province. However, the ideological, cultural, and spiritual exchange between the Chinese and African people still need to be further strengthened. So through dialogue between Chinese and African philosophy, seeking common ground while sharing differences and building a common discourse, I think will help the Chinese and African people connect with each other and build a China-African community with a shared future from the spiritual and cultural level. So there are many things we can do together in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Keqian, for that exhilarating grand tour of African and Chinese philosophies that you have brought into comparison. The central point of your talk is to attempt to address the two questions: why the Chinese and African philosophies should hold a conversation, and the second one is how, which is a methodological question to that. And by way of summary, you try to show lines of similarities, things that these two philosophical traditions share in common, articulated under the banner of the legitimacy question. And you were able to my, I was impressed to hear you talk about the struggle in Chinese philosophy by contemporary Chinese philosophers to deal with this legitimacy question. And you also drew attention to similar occurrence in African philosophy. That was wonderful. Coming to the two questions that the lecture attempted to address, the epistemological question, you were able to tell us, give us some reasons why it is necessary and very important that at this stage of scholarship and intellectual civilizations, that it is important that epistemologists of this South, such as African and Chinese philosophies, engage themselves. And besides the first interactions that they each have been struggling to initiate with Western epistemology for years now. And this resonates well with the research that Paul Dutton conducted and published in 2019, as he was attempting to articulate what he calls the Sino-African philosophy, using Baumann's comparative methodology of constructive engagement to show how African and Chinese philosophies can initiate the rounds of debates and discussions to mutual benefit of all. And like you said, Paul Dutton also went to the political, showing as we live in a time where diplomatic, military, and economic powers are gradually beginning to shift from west to the east. And given the central role that Africa has played in the political and economic ascendancy of the West, and the central position that Africa continues to occupy in the global scheme of things, that it may again become imperative for African intellectuals to engage with their Chinese in areas of culture and other policy issues that may affect the two regions of the world. So that addresses the epistemological question that you sought to address in your presentation. And then the how, you drew attention to your idea of Zhongdaology. And again, you try to point out similarities in methodological ideas that have been floated in African philosophy, such as Ezumezu, logic, and what have you, and other ones, Ubuntu, and what have you, showing similarities with what you have in China. And again, trying to apply Zhongdaology eventually as part of your grand plan to demonstrate the connections between the two philosophical traditions from the perspective of ontology, ethics, as well as political philosophy. Thank you very much. It was an enriching discussion, and I can tell you that I have, again, touched some ideas that will inspire some of the work that I am doing presently. I believe that others also share in that excitement that I have in this your presentation. So without further ado, may I permit me to open up the microphone and for our participants from different parts of the world to join the conversation. If you've got a question, you can ask the question. If it is a contribution that you have to make, please feel free to do so. However, I'd like to appeal to you to keep your questions and contributions very short and brief so that as many people as possible will be able to participate. Thank you very much, Professor Keqian, for that wonderful presentation. And the floor is open now for our participants to, okay, I can see hands raised already. Keep your question, go straight to the point, please. We don't want a second presentation. Let's begin with Rudolph. Rudolph, I can see your hand. So please take the microphone. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. My question is on Zhongdaology. I would like to kindly ask the professor if the difference that's coming on explaining that term is coming from different cultural backgrounds in China. I'm trying to think of China perhaps having different cultural societies with different cultures. So when they try to explain that Zhongdaology, perhaps they come up with some differences. So I'm asking whether the differences are coming on the explanation of the term Zhongdaology. Are these differences coming from different cultures? Thank you so much.
You mean how to deal with the conflict between different cultures when different cultures come together, confronted together? I think according to Chinese philosophy, first you must keep an open mind. As Confucius said that one should not concentrate on only his or herself, and then he should not be stubborn. He should not preoccupied with the idea that he himself is always correct, and then keep a conversation. I think the conversation is a very good idea for philosophical discussion. I think there is a conversation school of Calabar University. I have just, Jonathan have told me that. I think this is also, keep open mind, not be stubborn. Because in ancient Chinese, we don't have a kind of ontological persistence to some things. For instance, when something new comes to us, at first we always have some, because we are scared about something we don't know before, but just keep open, keep discussion. So if you read the Confucius Analects, or ancient Chinese preaching scholars' works, they have a lot of dialogue and discussion. Although in the early Chinese political works or literature works, the dialogue is very kind of is a very common style of conversation. Of course, they have similarities, but they also have differences. So in Chinese, we have say that is 求同存异, search for the common ground and suspend, put aside the differences. Put aside the difference, that is keep the culture diversity. People from different places, always have different heritages. That is good. Keep that. It's just like when we keep the ecological diversity, we also need to keep the cultural diversity. But that doesn't mean that we must have a conflicts. We as the third value have mentioned by, has suggested by the Ezumezu, they always have a third value. Also in Zhongdaology, we can also find that they have a common ground because we are all human beings. We definitely share something in common. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that response. Let's go over to Dr. Arabia Attu for his contribution. Over to you, Arabia.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your interesting talk. I just wanted to find out something from you. When you were presenting, you said in Chinese philosophy or Chinese metaphysics that nothingness plays a very important role in that metaphysics, which contrasted with African metaphysics, or at least the version I propose. Nothingness does not play any role in reality because nothingness is inconceivable, at least from my reading of African philosophy. So I'm very interested to know what the role of nothingness is in Chinese philosophy and how it all works. I'm really curious about that. Thank you.
Nothingness is actually, this is a feature of the Taoist philosophy. Taoist philosophy always believe that being come from no being, things are come from nothing. So in my understanding, actually many things do come from nothing. For instance, we have an online conference, this conference, we have a conference together. This is an event, this is a thing, this is a thing. But this thing originally is nothing. But you can say, oh, we have this event because we have Professor Xu and we have Professor Chimakonam, and that is not nothing. We are not nothing. But then when we come back to, for instance, myself, where I come from, who is I? Who is I? I also come from nothing. If you trace back to the very, very origin, that is empty. Many things, especially in Chinese, we say that is the shi. The shi. For instance, what is the socialism? What is the capitalism? What is the democracy? These are all shi. These shi are events. They don't have a fixed or substantial. It's not a substantial entity. It depends. It depends on many other factors, and other factors also depends on other factors, and other factors also originally is nothing. Originally is from nothing. So this is not only the Taoist philosophy, but also from the Indian Buddhist. Indian Buddhists also believe, Indian Buddhist also don't have a substantial concept of entity. They also think that human being is just empty. It's empty. Who is who is I? Fundamentally, I'm empty. I'm just come from nothing. This is probably a special Oriental ideology. If you read more about the Buddhist philosophy, you will find that the fundamental idea of Buddhism, that is everything is empty. The empty is the fundamental, the fundamental being. If you say that there is a being, the being is empty. Empty is nothing. Empty is nothing. This is, I think, is a typical Oriental way of thinking. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Before I come to you, firstly, I can see your hand up. Let me perhaps contribute to this very animating discussion on nothing being the source of everything. Perhaps there's a different way of thinking about nothing, or nothingness, other than the classic Western existentialist conception of that subject. From my understanding of what Professor Zhu said, nothingness in this way could be a form of disidentified entity, all right? The infinite return to the source. That source may be construed as nothing insofar as it lacks a definite identity. In my recent research, I have been toying with the concept of Oku as a fulcrum of all ideas. Oku itself is not something definite, but definite things emerge from it. And in that regard, I tend to relate to the ideas that Professor Zhu is trying to put forward. Quite some metaphysics there to digest. Thank you very much, Arabia, for that question and for your response, Professor Zhu. Let's go over to Emmanuel Ofuasia. Please ask your question or make your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chimakonam, and good afternoon from Lagos to everybody. Thank you, Professor Kang Chiu from China. That's a very good lecture from you. I enjoyed myself, and I'm glad I created time for this, so thank you very much. Specifically, I have 4 questions to ask you, and 2 of those questions are tied to the legitimacy issue, and the other 2 are tied to the logic aspect. So concerning the legitimacy issue, one of the questions I want to ask is there any equivalence of conceptual decolonization in Africa in Chinese philosophy? In African philosophy, we do conceptual decolonization. So I want to ask if there is anything in that regard, any scholarship concerning conceptual decolonization in Chinese philosophy. That's the first question. The second question, I want to ask you, is it ever possible for us to engage our indigenous ideas if we had not been tasked by the West? I appreciate your lecture, but I have read works from Chinese physicists and Eastern scholars like Gary Zukav, the Dancing Wuli Masters. I have read Fujov Capra, the Tao of Physics, where they try to show similarities or common grounds between Eastern mysticism and modern physics. So do we need to legitimate our ideas, whether Chinese or African, on the West for them to get legitimacy? So that's the second question. The third question is one of the 2 concerning logic. I want to ask you, Professor, what kind of laws of thought underpin the Chon logic? And I also want you to understand that for a system or a logic to be considered as a complete system, it must have comprised of a formal system, a methodology, and philosophical logic. I want to know if the Chon logic that you are talking about here has 3 of these components, or whether it's still a logic in research. The last question I want to ask you concerns Zen Buddhism. There's an aspect in Zen Buddhism where you talk about Koan logic. I read briefly about that in Bridge of Capra's The Tao of Physics. I want you to see if you can expatiate on that, the development of Koan logic in Zen Buddhism. Is it a logic? Is it word developing? What kind of logic is it? So that's it, sir, and I look forward to your responses. Thank you, sir.
Okay, you have 3 questions. I didn't catch you. The first question is about the legitimacy. You want to, you asked me.
I asked if there is an equivalence of conceptual decolonization in Chinese philosophy. Do you decolonize concepts in Chinese philosophy as we do in African philosophy?
Okay, can you text your question in the chat? Let me see. Can you text your question in the?
Okay. Yes. Yeah. He will chat his questions now. In the meantime,
I think that his second question is about the relationship between the African philosophy, Chinese philosophy, and Western philosophy. Of course, I think the principle apply in the conversation or dialogue between African philosophy and Chinese philosophy also applies to any other tradition. But the situation is that we usually in China, many scholars do the comparative philosophy between Chinese and Western philosophy. And then they have many studies between Chinese and Indian philosophy. But I don't think they have a scholar have okay, as a decolonization, I don't think have many scholars have do the study between the African and Chinese philosophy comparison. Okay, the decolonization, conceptual decolonization, is the idea I first read it in a book in a paper written by African scholars. In China, we, actually, we also have the similar ideas, but no one have openly produced this idea because China, basically China is not colonized by the Western powers. Only some place, for instance, Hong Kong, Taiwan, or some areas have been rented by the Westerners. But I think in the conceptual, in the culture, we also have a kind of colonized. You can call that culturally colonized, because in China today the ideology is very diversified. People have a lot of different kind of different ideas. At least we have many people in today's Chinese culture. They can be called that a liberal democracy, liberalists. But this dispute, this dispute among the ideas, if the Chinese culture have been formatted by the Western ideology, some people don't believe this. Some people that believe that this is inevitable. It is you cannot escape from this kind of effect. But others think that the traditional Chinese culture is like an organic whole, and the Western tools, Western framework is like a cutting board and the knife. They cut the original organic system of Chinese culture into pieces, and then resembled it according to the African Western logic. So people have different idea of this, but I don't know if it is possible for totally, decolonization all the Western ideas. I think probably it's not possible, but we can discuss. We can keep questioning the Western standard. This is not necessarily the universal, and we maybe have we explore the African tradition, Chinese tradition. We might find that they have some kind of alternative, and that is a contribution to the general human reasoning, to the human, to the real philosophy of all humankind. Okay, the second question, colleagues, you can also chat your question here. Yeah, if you have question, I can read this more. This. What is the third question? The third question.
Yeah, the second question is whether it is possible for Chinese philosophers to develop ideas without necessarily leveraging on the established similar ideas in Western ideas.
Yeah, this is possible. Actually, some they have different ways of rating the history of Chinese philosophy. Some history of Chinese philosophy is using the Western categories, Western concepts, and using the Chinese materials to fill in these frameworks. But they have other ways. They concentrated on the original Chinese questions, Chinese philosophical questions, using Chinese ideas. Actually, modern Chinese scholars have already developed many philosophical ideas from the traditional Chinese philosophy, such as yin, yang, and the qi. These words, when we compare it with the Western philosophy, we also found a difficulty to translate these concepts to the exact Western language. For instance, what is the qi? The qi. Qi, some ancient Chinese philosophers believe that the qi is everywhere. The qi is the fundamental existence of the things. But what is the qi? Qi, if we translate it to the similar English words, it is vapor, is air or gas or something like that. But that is not the exact equivalent to the Chinese philosophy. So this kind of a philosophy, originally, the philosophical concepts originally come from the traditional Chinese, have already been unified. Another concept is Dao. What is Dao? Some people believe that Dao is logic, logos, or principle, or something, or God, or even God, but actually it's not. Dao is not a God. Dao is not logos. Dao is just Dao. So the Dao have already been accepted by the philosophers outside of China. I think probably also they have some African original philosophical concept can be developed, can be conceptualized, and universalized.
That's all right. So
okay.
The third question now on the laws of thought that undergird the Chant logic. You didn't talk about that, sir.
Zhongdaology. What's your question? Can you type it again? Can you type it again?
Okay. Well, while you're typing that, let me also indicate that he didn't really speak about John logic, let alone
Yeah, I actually have a paper submitted to Jonathan and probably maybe published in one of the journals. Yeah, probably in that book, in that paper, I have discussed more details of the Zhongdaology.
Yes, that's true. It's a manuscript is submitted to Arumaroka Journal of Conversational Thinking. Okay, so thank you very much, Emmanuel Ofasia, for those wonderful engagements. Okay, I can see a question from Isaiah Negedu. So, Professor Zhu, there's a question in the chat box for you there.
The law. Yeah, this the law. The law, actually, I have already discussed in some of my speakings. The law, the fundamental law, if we trace back to the original fundamental law, you know, in ancient China, for instance, everything contains contradictions. Can this be called a law? And then every contradictions might have a chance to conciliate. Always they have a possibility to find a middle way. So every contradiction things are actually relying on each other. Can this be called a law, a natural law? Because, you know, if you don't have you know, everything in the society, in the nature, everything is related to each other. For instance, laws have a lot of laws. One law is that when good things, everyone is just the good things will be bad. That means anything go to the extreme. It will come back to its upside. And they also have a law about the yin yang. When the yin side overtakes the space, or the balance have been broken, they have a change. The change is pushed by the mutual relationship between yin and yang. Okay, what kind of law? With respect to the methodological dimension to your presentation, what theoretical framework informs your argument on how should China philosophy engage with African philosophy? I think this, in terms of this framework, maybe we can trace back to in the ancient time when Chinese and the Buddhist philosophy have meet with each other. They have no prior framework, just the begin a conversation, begin a dialogue, and then mutually absorb the ideas from each other. In the history of Chinese philosophy, you know, in the Han Dynasty, when the Buddhists come to China, most scholars are refused to take it. But gradually, the Buddhist philosophy have been spread among the scholars, intellectuals. So in the Song Dynasty and the Ming Dynasty, the so-called New Confucian scholars, they usually have a very good education of Buddhism. They read Buddhism. They have a good relation with the Buddhist monks, and they accept some of their ideas. That is why the traditional Confucianism can develop to a new stage that is the so-called the Neo-Confucianism in the Song and Ming dynasty. Although in the modern time, when the Western philosophy come into China, they also have a integration, exchange, mixing, and recreation. Maybe, just like a marriage between people from different races, and then they just mix it together and create something new. So I don't think that we will persist on the original tradition of Chinese philosophy. The tradition is always developed. During the way of development, they always adopt something new, and make some new creation. So I think it is possible for Chinese philosophy, although if we have more contact and communication, we can also share something. But from the Chinese philosophy, I think we not only need to conversation with Western philosophy, we have already done very much, but we still need to do some conversation with non-Western philosophy tradition, like African philosophy, Islamic philosophy, and some other philosophy. This is good. This is good for humankind, good for constructing the real universal philosophy.
Okay, Professor Zhu, that's one question there. I hope you'll be able to address it as briefly as possible. It is a question from Frederick Mayberg. Can you see it in the chat?
It is possible within context of Chinese philosophy to suspend our metaphysical beliefs about being and the nature of the world to find a super moral and ethic principle. I think, yeah, it is possible because in China, according to the Chinese tradition of philosophy, the moral standard is more likely stand on the mutual relationship, not relying on kind of a metaphysical entity. But this does not exclude the metaphysical ideas. For instance, I think the Zhong is the basic rule for basic principle for Chinese Confucian ethics. This means Zhong is an integration center. They have many dimensions. Many dimensions come together. For instance, do we believe God? Do we believe or use Chinese words, the Tian, the heaven, the heavenly mandate, the heavenly mandate? Okay, that is one of the components. But also, we are living in the secular world. We have relationship with my father, my mother, my daughter, my wife, my relatives, and the relationship also a dimension. So why Confucius said that if you want to establish yourself, you have to establish others. Don't do something to others if you don't want the others do the same to you. This kind of a relationship, including the relationship in family, among the family members, or between myself, my group, my family with other families in the society. The relationship is in the reality, So this is another dimension. And they also have some other dimensions. For instance, the contextual situation. Not all the moral standard is applicable in every situation, under any context. So in different situations, you have to face the fact in front of you. That is in Chinese Confucian text, 发而皆中节, hitting at the right target in front of you. You cannot just, without care about the things, the reality happened in front of you. It just come from an idea. The idea is kind of from God or something. You just persist on that. You don't face the reality. That is not good. So facing the reality, care the relationship among yourself and others, and although in your side you have a conscience. The conscience, according to Chinese Confucianism, is come from the heaven, that dimension. So what I call the zhong is not it is not an entity. It's not a substantial entity. It's kind of an integration, but it's just as integration is very important, more important than just one dimension, more important than just obey to what I believe is God teaching. So this is my understanding of the framework or the rule, the law of the Chinese way of thinking.
Thank you very much, Professor Keqian Zhu, and all those that asked questions or made contributions. There's one question that hasn't been addressed by Azar Negedu. I don't think we have time for that, but it's a crucial question. Perhaps we can take that with us as we leave today. Azar Negedu is asking, as we bid to engage across cultures such as Chinese and African, two epistemologies of the South, how do we avoid the superiorist mentality? How do we ensure that such engagement is mutually respectful? And I think it is a question that is very important whenever we are talking about cross-cultural dialogue or conversation. So thank you very much, Isaiah Negedu, and thanks to all of you that were able to join us from different parts of the world. Thank you most especially, Professor Keqian Zhu, for such an enriching discussion. I believe that many of us have been inspired in one way or the other to take comparative and intercultural philosophical discourses a little bit more seriously, especially across epistemologies of the South. Thank you very much to all of you. And this is, again, letting us know that we can all take turns to present our ideas in the University of Pretoria's philosophy seminar. You just simply have to write me an email, and then we take it off from there. And one of these days we'll gather to listen to you as well in an ongoing philosophical exchanges. Thank you very much to all of you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for your listening.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye all. Yeah.